There is something about Keanu Reeves that stays with you long after the credits roll. It is not just his action scenes or his quiet intensity on screen. It is who he is when the cameras stop rolling. He rides the subway like everyone else. He gives up his seat for strangers. He has faced unimaginable personal loss, and yet he never became bitter. Instead, he became kinder. That is what inspires me most about him. In a world where fame often changes people for the worse, Keanu Reeves became proof that success and humility can exist together. He treats everyone with respect, from movie executives to the crew members who work behind the scenes. He donates quietly, never seeking attention for his generosity. This story is inspired by that spirit. It is fictional, but its heart comes from the real kindness that Keanu Reeves represents. And the woman in this story, inspired by Sandra Bullock, shares that same warmth. Together, they remind us that true strength is not about how hard you can hit. It is about how much love you can give even when the world tries to take everything from you. Now let the story begin. The evening light was beginning to soften across the hills of Los Angeles, painting everything in shades of gold and quiet amber. There was a stillness in the air that evening, the kind that makes you stop and wonder if something is about to change. Sandra stood near her kitchen window, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, and she could not explain why her heart felt heavier than usual. Nothing was wrong, not exactly. The house was peaceful and the garden outside was calm. Yet something inside her whispered that the world was about to shift. It was a feeling she had learned to trust over the years, a gentle warning that lived somewhere between instinct and memory. She had just returned from Seoul 3 days ago, where she had spent 2 weeks working with children in underfunded schools. The trip had been beautiful and exhausting, filled with small hands reaching for hers and bright eyes filled with hope despite everything. But somewhere in the back of her mind, there was a moment she could not forget, a glimpse of something she was not meant to see. A black car parked in a narrow alley, men in dark suits exchanging white packages in complete silence. And then, eyes that met hers for just 1 second before she forced herself to look away and keep walking. She had told herself it was nothing. Tourists see strange things in unfamiliar cities all the time. But now, standing in her own home thousands of miles away, she could not shake the feeling that those eyes had followed her across the ocean. The first sign came the next morning. A car she did not recognize parked across the street for nearly 3 hours. Then another one appeared the following day, different color, but carrying the same heavy energy. She noticed a man walking past her gate twice in a single afternoon, glancing at her windows just a moment too long each time. Sandra was not a paranoid woman. She had spent decades in the public eye and understood that sometimes fans lingered nearby or photographers waited for the right shot. But this was different. These men were not carrying cameras. They were carrying silence, and their silence felt dangerous. On the 4th night, her phone rang at 2 in the morning. She answered without thinking, and there was only breathing on the other end. Slow and deliberate, almost patient, and then a soft click as the call ended. Sleep did not come easily after that. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through every person she could possibly call for help. Police would ask questions she could not answer. Her manager would panic and make everything worse. Her family would worry themselves sick over something she did not fully understand herself. And then, like a light switching on in a dark room, she remembered him. Keanu. They had met over 20 years ago on a film set, 2 young actors thrown together by fate and a screenplay about a bus that could not slow down. Even then, he had been different from the others, kind in ways that surprised her, thoughtful when no one was watching. Over the years, they had stayed in touch, not constantly, but enough to know the other was still out there somewhere. She had heard rumors about him, of course. Everyone in their industry had. Whispers that he had stepped away from acting for a few years and entered a world that no one talked about openly. Some said he had trained with people who lived in shadows. Others claimed he had become someone that even the most dangerous men feared to cross. She never asked him about any of it. Some truths are better left unspoken between friends. Her fingers hesitated over her phone for a long moment. She had not called him in almost 3 years. Would he even answer? Would he remember her the way she remembered him? The doubt lasted only a few seconds. Whatever Keanu had become in those hidden years, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was still the same man who gave up his seat on subways for tired strangers and spoke softly to nervous children who asked for autographs. That man would never ignore a friend in trouble. She pressed the call button and held her breath. After 4 rings, a voice answered. It was deeper than she remembered, quieter somehow, like a river that had learned to flow without making any sound at all. "Sandra," he said, just her name, nothing else. But in that single word, she heard something that made her exhale for the first time in 4 days. She heard safety. She told him everything, the charity trip to Seoul, the accidental glimpse in that dark alley, the cars that had been watching her home, the silent phone call that still echoed in her mind. Keanu listened without interrupting even once, and when she finally finished speaking, the line went quiet for what felt like an eternity. Then he spoke again, and his words were simple and clear. I am coming. He arrived the next evening, stepping out of a plain black car with no fanfare and no expression on his weathered face. Sandra watched him walk toward her door, and she noticed immediately how the years had changed him. His hair was longer now, streaked with threads of silver and gray, and there was a weight in his eyes that definitely had not been there before. But his movements were still graceful, still perfectly controlled, like a man who knew exactly how much strength he carried inside himself and chose every single day to keep it hidden from the world. When he reached her doorstep, he did not hug her or offer empty words of comfort. He simply looked at her with those deep, tired eyes, and in that single look, she understood that he believed every word she had told him. Inside her home, Keanu moved through the rooms like a ghost made of purpose and memory. He checked every window twice. He examined every lock with careful fingers. He noted angles and shadows and entry points that Sandra had never even considered in all her years of living there. When he finally returned to the living room, he sat across from her and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Tell me more about the men in that alley, he said. What exactly did those packages look like? Sandra closed her eyes and pulled the memory forward from wherever she had tried to bury it. They were white boxes, she said slowly. Medical packaging maybe, or something similar. There were red symbols printed on the sides, like a cross, but somehow different. The men themselves wore expensive suits, very clean and very organized. And one of them, the one who looked at me, he had a ring on his finger, gold with a dragon curling around it. Keanu's expression remained perfectly still, but something flickered deep behind his eyes. Sandra saw it clearly even in the dim light of her living room. Recognition. You know who they are, she said quietly. It was not a question. He nodded once slowly. They call themselves the Silent Hand, Korean syndicate, very old, very powerful, very patient. Their leader is a man known only as Director Shin, and he does not forgive witnesses, Sandra. He never has. Sandra felt her heart sink into her stomach. So they are going to kill me, she whispered. Keanu leaned forward in his chair, and for the first time since he had arrived, his voice carried genuine warmth beneath its quiet surface. Not while I am here, he said firmly. I made a promise to myself a very long time ago. I would never let fear win again, and I would never let an innocent person suffer if I had any power to stop it. That night, just after midnight, 3 men appeared outside Sandra's front gate. They moved like professionals, silent and perfectly coordinated, spreading out to cover every possible angle of approach. Keanu spotted them through a gap in the curtains, and he told Sandra to stay inside no matter what she heard. Then he walked out the front door alone, closing it softly behind him. Sandra watched from behind a curtain, her breath frozen in her throat. Keanu stood completely motionless in the center of her driveway as the 3 men approached with careful steps. They stopped about 20 feet away, and for a long, terrible moment, nobody moved or spoke. Then Keanu slowly lifted his head, and he looked directly at them. It was not a glare. It was not aggression or threat. It was simply a stare, calm and absolute, carrying the weight of every single battle he had ever fought and survived. Sandra had never witnessed anything quite like it in all her years. The air itself seemed to grow colder, and even from inside the safety of her house, she could feel the raw power radiating from that single unwavering gaze. The 3 men hesitated visibly. One of them took a small step backward without seeming to realize it. Another reached quickly for his phone, pressing it to his ear and speaking in rapid, desperate Korean. After exactly 30 seconds of tense silence, all 3 of them turned around and walked away into the darkness without a single word. Keanu remained standing in the driveway for another full minute, watching their shadows disappear completely into the night. When he finally came back inside, his face was still calm, but Sandra could see the tension coiled tight in his shoulders. They will report back to Director Shin, he said quietly. And Shin will not send scouts the next time. He is a proud man. He will come here himself. Sandra looked at him with fear and confusion swirling together inside her chest. What do we do now? She asked softly. Keanu turned to face her, and for the first time that long night, he allowed himself a small, tired smile. We wait, he said, and we prepare ourselves carefully, because when Shin finally arrives, I need to look directly into his eyes. Something about all of this feels wrong to me, Sandra, deeply wrong. I do not think he actually wants to kill you. I think he is afraid of something, and I need to find out exactly what that something is." The words hung suspended in the air like both a promise and a warning wrapped together. Sandra did not know what the coming days would bring to her doorstep, but she knew one thing with complete certainty. Whatever darkness was slowly approaching them, she was no longer facing it alone. Morning arrived slowly that day, creeping through the curtains like it was afraid to disturb the fragile peace inside Sandra's home. The sunlight fell in soft, golden patches across the wooden floor, and somewhere outside a bird was singing a melody that felt strangely out of place given everything that had happened the night before. Sandra had not slept at all. She had spent the entire night sitting in her living room, wrapped in a blanket that did nothing to warm the coldness spreading through her chest. But Keanu had stayed awake with her through all of it, sitting quietly in the chair by the door, his eyes never resting even for a single moment. She watched him now as the morning light touched his face, and she noticed details she had missed in the darkness. There were lines around his eyes that told stories of sleepless years and battles fought far from any spotlight. His hands rested calmly on his knees, but she could see faint scars crossing his knuckles like memories written in skin. This was not the same young man she had laughed with on a movie set all those years ago. This was someone who had walked through fire and somehow emerged still standing, still breathing, still choosing kindness despite everything. "Keanu," she said softly, breaking the silence, "who are you really? What happened to you in all those years we lost touch?" He turned his head slowly toward the window, watching the morning light spread across her garden. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a heaviness that made Sandra's heart ache. "I lost someone," he began quietly, "someone I loved more than I ever knew was possible, and when she was gone, I did not know how to exist in a world without her. So I disappeared. I trained with men who had dedicated their entire lives to protecting others. I learned things that most people only see in nightmares, but none of it brought her back, Sandra. None of it filled the emptiness she left behind." Sandra felt tears forming in her eyes. "I am so sorry," she whispered. Keanu turned back to face her with something almost gentle in his tired eyes. "Do not be sorry," he said softly. "Grief taught me things that happiness never could have. It taught me that kindness is never wasted. And it taught me that protecting the innocent is the only purpose worth living for when you have nothing left to lose." Their quiet moment was interrupted by Keanu's phone vibrating against the table. He studied the screen for several long seconds, then looked up at Sandra with careful concern in his expression. "They are coming," he said simply. "Director Shin will be here by tonight. He has requested a meeting instead of a confrontation." Sandra felt confusion mixing with her fear. "A meeting," she repeated. "Why would a crime boss want to meet with us?" Keanu leaned forward in his chair. "That is exactly what I intend to find out," he replied. "If Shin truly wanted you silenced, he would have sent assassins, not scouts. But instead he has been watching and waiting and almost hesitating. That tells me there is more to this story than we currently understand." The hours that followed stretched into eternity. Keanu spent the afternoon preparing in ways Sandra did not fully understand. He made phone calls in languages she did not recognize. He studied photographs with intense concentration. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Sandra found herself standing before her bathroom mirror, staring at her own reflection like she was looking at a stranger. The woman staring back looked tired and afraid, but there was something else there too. A spark of determination that surprised her. She emerged to find Keanu waiting by the front door. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. "No," she admitted honestly, "but I do not think I ever will be, so we might as well go now." The abandoned theater was a crumbling monument to forgotten elegance. Its facade had once been beautiful, but years of neglect had turned that beauty into something haunting. The windows were dark and empty. The silence surrounding the building felt almost alive, like it was holding its breath. Keanu parked behind the theater and turned to face Sandra one final time. "Whatever happens inside," he said firmly, "I need you to trust me. If I tell you to run, you run without looking back. Can you promise me that?" "I promise," she whispered. They entered through a side door into a vast, dark interior filled with rows of dusty seats facing an ancient stage. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the ceiling, creating pools of silver light across the floor. And standing at the center of the stage, surrounded by 8 men in dark suits, was Director Shin. He was smaller than Sandra had expected, a compact man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that held sharp intelligence. But there was something else in those eyes that surprised her deeply. Exhaustion. And beneath that, what almost looked like sadness. Keanu walked forward slowly, Sandra following close behind. They stopped about 20 feet from the stage. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Shin inclined his head slightly. So he said quietly, "You are the one they whisper about. The man whose stare sends my soldiers running like frightened children. I expected someone taller." Keanu did not smile. "I came here to understand why you are terrorizing an innocent woman who has done nothing wrong." Shin's expression flickered with something like surprise. Terrorizing, he repeated slowly. "Is that what you believe this is?" He let out a heavy sigh. "Then I have failed even more completely than I realized." "Explain," Keanu said. "Tell us what she saw in that alley." Shin looked directly at Sandra. "What you saw was not what you think. Those packages were not drugs or weapons." "Then what were they?" Sandra asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Shin closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, Sandra saw genuine pain there. "Medicine," he said quietly. "Insulin, antibiotics, surgical supplies, all bound for underground networks that smuggle medical care into North Korea. There are thousands of children dying from treatable diseases because their government refuses outside help. My organization has been running these operations for 15 years. The words hit Sandra like an unexpected wave. She looked at Keanu and saw the same shock hidden beneath his controlled expression. "When you witnessed our exchange," Shin continued, "we faced a terrible decision. If word got out, everything would collapse. The supply routes would be discovered. The brave people who risked their lives would be arrested. We needed to understand how much you knew. But our methods were clumsy and cruel despite our intentions." Keanu studied Shin with penetrating intensity. "Why should we believe any of this?" Shin reached slowly into his jacket and withdrew a worn photograph. It showed a young girl with bright eyes and a smile radiating pure joy. "My granddaughter," Shin said quietly. "She died 11 years ago from a disease that could have been cured with simple medication her country refused to provide. I swore on her memory that no other child would suffer the same fate. Everything I have built since then has been for her." Sandra felt tears streaming down her face. The fear that had gripped her heart for days was dissolving, replaced by something far more powerful. "I believe you," Keanu said simply. Shin's eyes widened with visible relief. "But believing you is not enough," Keanu continued. "We need a better way forward that does not involve following innocent women or making terrifying midnight phone calls." Shin nodded slowly. "That is exactly what I was hoping you might say." Sandra stepped forward, driven by instinct. "If your cause is truly noble," she said, "maybe there is another way. I have connections in the humanitarian world, organizations that could help legitimize what you are trying to accomplish." Shin looked at her with genuine surprise. "You would help us, after everything we put you through." Sandra thought about the children she had met in Seoul. The same children existed across an invisible border, suffering while the world looked away. "Yes," she said firmly, "because helping people is never wrong." Shin stepped down from the stage and extended his hand toward Sandra. It was an offer of trust from a man who clearly had not trusted easily in years. She looked at Keanu, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. Then she shook Shin's hand. But before anyone could speak another word, the theater's side door burst open with a violent crash. Armed men poured into the space, faces covered, weapons raised. And leading them was a figure that made Shin's face drain of color. His own son. The young man stepped forward with cold fury blazing in his eyes, his gun pointed at his father's chest. "You have grown weak, old man," he spat, "making deals with outsiders instead of eliminating threats. The council has decided. Your time leading the Silent Hand is over." Shin's men moved to protect their leader, but they were vastly outnumbered. The theater transformed instantly from a space of peace into a powder keg. Keanu stepped in front of Sandra, his body becoming a shield. His hand moved toward something hidden beneath his coat, but he did not draw it yet. His eyes locked onto the young man's face, calculating every possible outcome. Sandra's heart pounded as she realized everything they had built could collapse in seconds. The truth about Shin's work, the chance to help dying children, all of it hung by a thread fraying more with every moment. and surrounded by armed men and betrayal and the sharp edge of violence, she understood with terrible clarity that the real test was only just beginning. The air inside the theater had changed completely in the span of a single heartbeat. What had been a space of fragile hope and unexpected understanding now crackled with tension so thick that Sandra could feel it pressing against her skin like something physical and alive. She stood frozen behind Keanu, her eyes darting between the armed men surrounding them and the young man whose gun remained pointed steadily at his own father's chest. This was not how any of them had imagined this night would unfold. This was chaos wearing the mask of calculated betrayal. Director Shin stood perfectly still, his weathered face revealing nothing of the storm that must have been raging inside him. But Sandra noticed that his hands were trembling slightly at his sides, and she understood in that moment that this confrontation was not entirely unexpected. Somewhere deep in his tired eyes, there was a sadness that spoke of warnings ignored and trust misplaced over many painful years. Jin-woo, Shin said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a father addressing a child he barely recognized anymore. "What have you done?" The young man laughed bitterly, and the sound echoed through the empty theater like something broken and sharp. "What have I done?" he repeated with venom dripping from every word. "I have done what you were too weak to do yourself, father. I have taken control of an organization that you have been slowly destroying with your foolish humanitarian dreams. Do you think the council does not see what you have become? Do you think they do not whisper about how the great director Shin has grown soft and sentimental in his old age?" Shin's jaw tightened visibly, but his voice remained calm. "Everything I have built has been to honor your sister's memory, to save children who would otherwise die forgotten and alone. How can you stand there and call that weakness?" Jin-woo's expression twisted with something that looked almost like pain before it hardened again into cold fury. "Do not speak her name," he hissed. "You have used her death as an excuse for 15 years, hiding behind charity while our enemies grow stronger and our influence fades. The silent hand was meant to be feared, father, not pitied." Sandra watched this exchange with her heart pounding against her ribs. She could see the history of wounds and disappointments layered beneath every word these two men exchanged. This was not simply a power struggle within a criminal organization. This was a family being torn apart by grief that had never properly healed. Keanu remained motionless in front of her, his posture relaxed, but his attention clearly fixed on every detail of the unfolding situation. Sandra knew he was calculating distances and angles and possibilities faster than she could even process what was happening. But she also sensed that he was waiting for something, some moment or opening that had not yet arrived. Jin-woo turned his attention toward them now, and Sandra felt a chill run through her entire body when his cold eyes landed on her face. "And you?" he said with disgust coloring his voice. "The American actress who stumbled into matters that did not concern her. Do you have any idea how much trouble you have caused by simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time?" Sandra wanted to shrink back from his gaze, but something inside her refused to give him that satisfaction. She thought of the children in Seoul, the bright eyes and small hands reaching for connection and hope. She thought of the photograph Shin had shown them, the little girl whose death had set all of this into motion. And she realized that backing down now would mean betraying everything those children represented. "I saw people trying to help the helpless," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "If that makes me a problem, then maybe you should ask yourself what kind of person finds compassion threatening." Jin-woo's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised by her defiance. Then his lips curled into a cruel smile. "Brave words from a woman surrounded by men with guns," he said coldly. "Let us see if that courage survives what comes next." He raised his hand in a signal to his men, and Sandra saw several of them step forward with clear intent. This was it. The moment when everything would either fall apart completely or somehow find a way through to the other side. But before anyone could move another step, Keanu spoke for the first time since the ambush began, and his voice cut through the tension like a blade made of absolute calm. "Jin-woo," he said quietly, "look at me." Something in his tone made the young man pause despite himself. His eyes shifted from Sandra to Keanu, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the dusty expanse of the theater floor. Keanu continued speaking in that same measured voice. "You think you understand power because you have men with weapons following your orders. You think fear is strength because you have seen people tremble before you. But you are wrong about both of those things. Real power is not about how many people you can frighten. Real power is about how many people you can inspire to stand beside you when everything goes wrong. Jin Woo scoffed, but Sandra noticed that his gun hand had lowered slightly without him seeming to realize it. "You speak like a philosopher, not a fighter," he said dismissively. "What could you possibly know about my world?" Keanu took one slow step forward, and every armed man in the theater tensed simultaneously. But he made no aggressive movement. He simply stood there, radiating a presence that seemed to fill the entire space around him. "I know that your sister died when you were young," Keanu said softly. "I know that losing her broke something inside your father that he has been trying to fix ever since. And I know that instead of honoring her memory together, the two of you have spent years pushing each other further and further apart. Grief does that to families sometimes. It builds walls where there should be bridges." Jin Woo's face flickered with something vulnerable before his anger surged back to the surface. "You know nothing about my sister," he spat. "You know nothing about what our family has suffered." Keanu nodded slowly. "You are right," he acknowledged. "I do not know your specific pain, but I know loss, Jin Woo. I know what it feels like to love someone so completely that their absence becomes a wound that never fully heals. And I know that the choices we make in our grief define who we become afterward. Your father chose to channel his pain into saving lives. You are choosing to channel yours into taking control through violence. Which path do you think your sister would have wanted you to walk?" The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Sandra watched Jin Woo's expression shifting through emotions too complex to name. Anger and pain and doubt, and something that might have been the first fragile stirrings of self-reflection. Shin stepped forward now, moving slowly toward his son with his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Jin Woo," he said gently, "I know I failed you in many ways after she died. I was so consumed by my own grief that I could not see how much you were suffering too. I threw myself into work and causes and missions, and I left you to carry your pain alone. That was wrong of me, deeply wrong." Jin Woo's gun hand was shaking now, the weapon no longer pointed with steady conviction. The mask of cold fury was cracking, and beneath it Sandra could see the wounded boy who had never stopped mourning his sister. "She would not want this," Shin continued softly. "She would not want her brothers fighting over power while children die in silence across a border we cannot cross openly. She would want us to remember why we started this work in the first place. She would want us to be a family again." The theater had grown impossibly quiet. Even the armed men seemed frozen in place, uncertain of what they were witnessing or what they should do about it. Jin Woo lowered his gun completely now, his hand dropping to his side as if the weapon had suddenly become too heavy to hold. His face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out broken and raw. "I was 12 years old when she died," he whispered, "and you disappeared into your mission and left me behind. Every day I watched you risk everything for strangers while I sat alone wondering if you even remembered I existed. I hated you for that, Father. I hated you so much that I convinced myself destroying your work was the only way to finally get your attention." Shin's eyes filled with tears that he did not try to hide. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice cracking with decades of unspoken regret. "I am so deeply sorry, my son." The moment stretched between them, fragile and trembling with the weight of years of accumulated pain. Sandra felt tears running down her own cheeks as she witnessed something she had never expected to see in this place of shadows and danger. A father and son standing at the edge of either reconciliation or complete destruction. Keanu stepped back slowly, creating space for whatever would happen next. His eyes never left the scene unfolding before them, but Sandra could see that his posture had relaxed slightly. He had done what he could. The rest was up to them. Jin Woo looked at his father for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted like ice beginning to thaw under unexpected sunlight. Then he did something that made every person in the theater hold their breath. He dropped his gun. The weapon clattered against the floor with a sound that echoed through the silence like the closing of a heavy door. Jin Woo's men looked at each other with confusion and uncertainty, their own weapons still raised, but their conviction clearly wavering. "Stand down," Jin Woo said quietly, his voice carrying a new tone that Sandra did not immediately recognize. Then she realized what it was: exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes when you finally stop fighting against yourself. The armed men hesitated, looking between Jin Woo and their leader for guidance. Slowly, one by one, they lowered their weapons. The immediate threat was dissolving, but Sandra could feel that this moment was far from over. Shin crossed the remaining distance between himself and his son. For a moment they simply stood there facing each other, years of pain and misunderstanding hanging in the narrow space between them. Then Shin opened his arms, and Jin Woo collapsed into them like a child who had finally found his way home after being lost for far too long. Sandra watched them embrace, father and son holding each other in the dusty moonlit theater, and she felt something profound shifting in the atmosphere around them. This was what redemption looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but two broken people choosing to reach for each other instead of pushing further apart. Keanu moved quietly to stand beside her, and she felt his presence like an anchor in the swirling emotions of the moment. They watched together as Shin and Jin Woo slowly released each other, their faces wet with tears but their eyes holding something that had not been there before. Hope. But before anyone could speak or move or begin processing what had just happened, a sound came from the back of the theater that made Sandra's blood freeze in her veins. Slow, deliberate applause. Everyone turned toward the source of the sound, and Sandra saw a figure emerging from the shadows near the main entrance. It was a woman, tall and elegant, dressed in a perfectly tailored white suit that seemed to glow in the dim light. Her face was beautiful but cold, and her eyes held an intelligence that made Sandra immediately uncomfortable. How touching, the woman said, her voice carrying easily through the empty space. A family reunited through the power of love and understanding. It almost makes me regret what I have to do next. Shin's expression hardened as recognition dawned on his face. Commissioner Yang, he said flatly, I should have known the council would not trust Jin Woo to handle this alone. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The council trusts no one completely, Director Shin. That is why we have survived for over a century. Your son's little rebellion was useful for exposing your weaknesses, but surely you did not think we would leave the outcome to chance. More figures emerged from the shadows behind her. Not the rough soldiers Jin Woo had brought, but professionals whose every movement spoke of deadly training and absolute discipline. Sandra counted at least 15 of them, and her heart sank as she realized that whatever peace they had just achieved meant nothing to this woman. Keanu stepped forward again, placing himself between the new threat and everyone else. Commissioner, he said calmly, you do not want to do this. Yang's eyes flickered with interest as she studied him. Ah yes, she said softly, the legendary one. I have heard so many stories about you. Tell me, are any of them actually true? All of them, Keanu replied without hesitation, and some that have not been told yet. Yang laughed, and the sound was musical and terrifying at the same time. I suppose we shall see, she said, but first, I have an offer to make, one that benefits everyone in this room. Sandra felt dread coiling in her stomach as Yang's cold eyes swept across the assembled group. Whatever this woman was about to propose, Sandra knew instinctively that it would come with a price none of them wanted to pay. The theater fell silent once again, waiting for the next words that would determine all of their fates. The silence that followed Commissioner Yang's words felt like the calm before a devastating storm. Sandra stood frozen, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in tragedy. The woman in white radiated a confidence that spoke of someone who had never lost a negotiation in her entire life. Her soldiers stood ready behind her, weapons concealed, but presence unmistakable. Keanu remained perfectly still, his eyes locked onto Yang with that same penetrating stare that had sent men running into the night. But this woman did not flinch or look away. She met his gaze with equal intensity, two forces of nature recognizing each other across enemy lines. Your offer, Keanu said quietly, speak it. Yang smiled and took several steps closer, her heels clicking against the dusty floor with deliberate rhythm. It is quite simple, really, she said smoothly. Director Shin's humanitarian operations have become an embarrassment to certain powerful members of our council. His sentimentality threatens business relationships that have taken decades to cultivate. The council wants him removed from leadership permanently. Jin Woo tensed beside his father, the weight of his recent betrayal clearly crushing him with fresh guilt. This was partly his doing. His rebellion had exposed vulnerabilities that this woman was now exploiting. Yang continued, her eyes sweeping across each person in the theater. However, I am not without appreciation for practical solutions. Shin's refugee networks have value that extends beyond mere charity. The infrastructure he has built could serve multiple purposes if managed correctly. So here is my proposal. Shin retires quietly from all leadership positions. His son takes nominal control under council supervision. The humanitarian work continues, but becomes integrated with our other interests. And everyone in this room walks away alive. Sandra felt sick at the implications hidden within those carefully chosen words. She understood immediately what integration meant. The medicine shipments would become cover for darker cargo. The networks built to save children would be twisted into something corrupt and harmful. Shin stepped forward, his weathered face hardening with resolve. "You want to poison everything I have built," he said flatly. "Turn healing into harm and hope into despair. That is not a negotiation, Commissioner. That is destruction wearing a diplomatic mask." Yang shrugged elegantly. "Call it what you wish. The outcome remains the same regardless of the words we use to describe it. The Council has already decided. I am merely here to offer you a graceful exit instead of a violent one." The threat hung in the air like smoke, but Sandra noticed something shifting in the atmosphere around her. Keanu had not moved or spoken, but his presence seemed to be growing somehow, filling the space with something invisible but undeniable. The soldiers behind Yang were becoming restless, their professional composure showing small cracks around the edges. Then Keanu did something unexpected. He laughed softly. Yang's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. "You find something amusing about your situation?" she asked coldly. Keanu shook his head slowly. "Not my situation," he replied. "Yours. You came here tonight believing you held all the power. You brought soldiers and threats and calculated exactly how this confrontation would unfold. But you made one critical mistake, Commissioner." Yang's eyes narrowed, and what mistake would that be? Keanu took one step forward, and Sandra watched as every soldier behind Yang instinctively shifted backward. That subtle movement revealed everything about the fear this man inspired simply by existing. "You assumed that power comes from weapons and numbers and political maneuvering," Keanu said quietly. "But real power comes from something you clearly do not understand. It comes from purpose, from conviction, from being willing to sacrifice everything for something greater than yourself. Director Shin has spent 15 years building networks that save innocent lives. His people believe in that mission. They believe in him, and that kind of loyalty cannot be bought or threatened away." Yang scoffed, but her voice carried less certainty than before. "Pretty words," she said dismissively, "but words do not stop bullets." "No," Keanu agreed softly, "but sometimes they stop the people holding the guns." He turned then, not toward Yang or her soldiers, but toward the men who had arrived with Jin Woo. He looked at each of them in turn, his eyes carrying a question that needed no words. "Some of you have been with Director Shin for years," he said calmly. "You know what his work means. You have seen the medicine reach children who would otherwise die. You have watched families reunited across impossible borders. You joined the Silent Hand because you believed in something worth fighting for. So ask yourselves now, is this the moment you abandon everything that gave your lives meaning? Or is this the moment you remember why you started walking this path in the first place?" The silence that followed was profound. Sandra watched emotions flickering across the faces of Shin's former soldiers, shame and doubt and something that looked like awakening conscience. Then one of them stepped forward, moving away from Yang's formation and walking toward Director Shin. Another followed, then another. Within moments, nearly half of the armed men in the theater had switched sides, their allegiance shifting like a tide turning back toward shore. Yang's composure finally cracked, real anger flashing across her beautiful face. "You think this changes anything?" she hissed. "The council will simply send more soldiers. This defiance accomplishes nothing except delaying the inevitable." But now it was Shin who stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Keanu. His voice carried a strength that seemed to have been renewed by everything that had happened tonight. "Then let them come," he said firmly, "because you have miscalculated something fundamental, Commissioner. You believed that threatening my life would make me surrender my principles, but I have been prepared to die for this cause since the day my granddaughter drew her last breath. What you fail to understand is that I am not afraid of the Council. I am not afraid of you, and I am not afraid of whatever comes next." Sandra found herself moving forward too, drawn by an impulse she did not fully understand. She came to stand beside these two men, forming a line of defiance against everything Yang represented. "I am just an actress," Sandra said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I came here tonight terrified of shadows and strangers and things I did not understand. But now I see clearly what is actually happening. You represent fear and control, and the belief that power justifies cruelty. Director Shin represents hope and sacrifice, and the belief that every life has value. I know which side of that line I want to stand on. Yang stared at the three of them, her calculating mind clearly processing the changed circumstances. The balance of power in the theater had shifted dramatically. Her remaining soldiers were outnumbered now, and their confidence had been visibly shaken by the defections they had just witnessed. Jinwoo moved to stand with his father, his earlier rebellion transformed into something completely different. I spent years hating you, he said quietly to Shin. I convinced myself that destroying your work would somehow fill the emptiness inside me. But I was wrong. She would have wanted us united, father. She would have wanted us fighting together for something that matters. Shin placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and the gesture carried more healing than any words could have expressed. Yang surveyed the scene before her, and Sandra watched something shift behind those cold, intelligent eyes. It was not defeat exactly, but perhaps the recognition that this particular battle could not be won tonight. This is not over, Yang said flatly. The council does not forget defiance, and they do not forgive weakness in their ranks. Keanu met her gaze one final time, his stare carrying the weight of everything he had survived and everyone he had protected throughout his extraordinary life. Then tell your council something for me, he said quietly. Tell them that the world is watching now. This woman beside me has connections they cannot imagine and a platform that reaches millions of people. If anything happens to Director Shin or his networks, the whole world will know exactly who is responsible and why. Sandra felt the truth of those words settling into her bones. She understood now what her role in all of this could be. Not as a victim or a bystander, but as a voice that could shine light into shadows where people like Yang preferred to operate. Yang studied them all for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned without another word and walked toward the theater's exit. Her remaining soldiers followed in disciplined formation, disappearing into the night like ghosts retreating from the dawn. The theater fell silent once again, but this time the silence felt different. It was not tension or fear or uncertainty. It was the quiet that comes after a storm passes and the world begins to breathe again. Shin turned to face Keanu and Sandra, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I do not know how to thank you, he said softly. You came here as strangers and you leave as family. Keanu placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. Build something beautiful with your second chance, he said simply. That will be thanks enough. Sandra wiped her own tears and looked around at the unlikely group assembled in this crumbling theater. A grieving father, a lost son finding his way home, soldiers remembering their purpose, a legendary protector, and herself, an ordinary woman who had stumbled into something extraordinary. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Sandra used her connections and influence to establish legitimate channels for Shin's humanitarian work. Foundations were created. Partnerships were formed with organizations that could provide protection and resources. The children who had been dying in silence across the border began receiving medicine through networks that no longer needed to hide in shadows. Jinwoo worked beside his father, their relationship slowly healing through shared purpose and honest conversation. The wounds of 15 years could not be erased overnight, but each day brought them closer to the reconciliation they both desperately needed. Keanu disappeared quietly, as he always did when the immediate danger passed. But before he left, he shared one final moment with Sandra on the morning after the theater confrontation. They stood together watching the sunrise paint the Los Angeles skyline in shades of gold and pink and soft orange. The world looked fresh and possible in that gentle light, cleansed somehow by everything they had survived together. What happens now? Sandra asked softly. Do you just go back to your life until the next crisis appears? Keanu smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had seen from him since they reunited. Something like that, he admitted, but this one felt different somehow. This one reminded me why any of it matters. Sandra nodded slowly, understanding what he meant without needing further explanation. Will I see you again? She asked. He looked at her with warmth and affection in his tired eyes. Probably not for a while, he said honestly, but you know how to reach me now, and if you ever need me again, I will come. That is a promise. Then he was gone, walking toward a waiting car that would carry him back into whatever mysterious life he had built for himself. Sandra watched until he disappeared from view, feeling grateful and transformed, and somehow more herself than she had been in years. This story teaches us several truths that matter deeply in our complex world. First, it shows us that appearances often deceive. Director Shin appeared to be a dangerous criminal, but he was actually a grieving grandfather trying to save innocent children. We must learn to look beyond our initial judgments and seek understanding before we condemn. Second, it reminds us that grief can either destroy us or transform us into something greater. Shin channeled his loss into purpose. Keanu channeled his into protection. Jin-woo almost let his consume him entirely. The choice of how we carry our pain defines the people we become. Third, it demonstrates that true strength is not measured by how much force we can apply, but by how much compassion we can maintain when force seems easier. Keanu could have responded to every threat with violence, but he chose words and presence and patience instead. Fourth, it shows us that redemption remains possible even when we have made terrible mistakes. Jin-woo betrayed his father completely, yet found his way back through honesty and accountability. Finally, it teaches us that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences simply by choosing to stand for something beyond themselves. Sandra was just an actress who witnessed something she did not understand, but her willingness to engage rather than retreat changed everything. Kindness is never weakness, humility is never cowardice, respect is never surrender. These are the true foundations of strength that the world desperately needs. And sometimes, just sometimes, a single unwavering stare can remind us all of who we have the potential to become.